Hey, Will King here. It's Today on the Build Show. I want to do something a little bit different than my normal videos. We're going to look back at a project that I did several years ago. I want to take you through the details, why it was so interesting to me, and how it really set me up for a future in commercial real estate. So let's take a look at it. All right, so in the summer of 2018, I started looking at a property here in Florence. And in fact, I was trying to lease the property to start with and then realized it was actually for sale too. So that led me into negotiating the deal, looking at the project, and ultimately buying the property. It was built around 1900. And it was called the House of Vacuums because for years, probably 40, 50 years, it had been a vacuum cleaner store, which is funny because even when we started construction, there were still people from the community bringing their old Hoover vacuum cleaners down there trying to get them worked on. So it was a very mom and pop shop, and it was sad to see that business close, but ultimately it led us to being able to buy that property. So I guess to talk about the structure as a whole, so this is a downtown building to kind of give you the idea of the setting. Pretty busy street, and it's really on the end of a block. So we own the end building and then the one beside it, and there were several more connected to it going down the street. But they consisted of just brick exterior walls, and that was the first time I had really seen an exterior wall of nothing but brick. And this is, I think it was 4 or 5 courses thick of brick, and that was it. There was no block or CMU or poured concrete. It was literally just old solid brick made up the structure of this building. So we had a basement level, we had a main floor level, and then we had a top floor. These structures were 20 foot wide on the inside and about 40 feet deep on the inside. They were actually, the front wall ran on an angle, so the lengths of the building actually varied a little bit. So we had the brick walls on the outside all the way around and a common brick wall in the middle. And the way this thing was built, they actually had true 2x14 floor joists on the main level that were just pocketed into the brick, which is a really neat thing to see if you've never seen how an old building was built like that. They literally would just pocket it into that brick wall and push that floor joist inside of it, and that's what it sat on. They didn't have hangers, they didn't have fancy connections like we do now, or fancy connectors like we do now. They literally just had to sit on the brick. So that was the main level. And then the top floor actually had, I think there were 2x10s spanning 20 feet. So you can imagine what that looked like. There was quite the deflection in the middle, or the bow in the middle. Now I will say it's not your normal lumber that we see today. This lumber was true 2-inch thick, old growth, heart pine lumber. Which is really neat. We were actually able to repurpose some of those for the stair treads going up to the loft apartments. So what we did initially, we cleaned the buildings out. There was so much trash, debris, and just rotted material from a roof leak that we had to pull out. We cleaned the building out completely, okay? And then we basically started over with nothing but the brick walls of this structure. That's all that we started. That's all we kept. And speaking of the brick, now I will say one thing that we did, we pulled the plaster off. We wanted that exposed brick look. And I actually learned a little bit about that because in I guess those old buildings built in that time period, the masons were not ever intending on you to see that brick. That's why they covered it with the mortar or the plaster that was the finished look for 100 years. But a mason actually told me that when they constructed those buildings like that, they actually used their interns or their junior masons to lay a lot of that brick. And you can tell when you pull the mortar off at just how not straight the brick was. It was very, I guess, ugly, if you will, if you saw it today on a new house. But to me, it gives those old buildings character. So we were able to pull all that mortar off, or that plaster off those walls, and then sealed the brick to try to help the dust from being a huge problem inside the finished space. There was lots of brick repair. There was lots of windows that were falling out. There was holes cut between the two buildings. All of those had to be relaid. We were able to repurpose a lot of the brick that were left over. We did have to acquire a few more to match, or that was close to matching to fill in. So we had an engineer involved, and the structural engineer basically came up with a plan to go into the basement level and put these pretty large footers. They varied in sizes, but just imagine 4x5 or 4x6 footers that were, I think they were 2 feet deep as well, and a lot of rebar in these footers. But we held them off the exterior wall, so they came in about 4 feet to center. And there we had I-beams anchored into those footers, or on top of them, that came up. And then on top of those posts, we actually had an I-beam running across the structure, brick to brick. So at that point, we were able to make floor trusses saddle those I-beams, and then all the weight bearing was actually on those steel posts and the new footers, with the intention that all the load bearing would be off the brick walls. The engineers didn't feel like the brick wall was dangerous, that it's in any risk of falling over or collapsing, but the 100 pounds per square foot floor load, they wanted it transferred down to new steel, new concrete, and which led to that new foundation we put in. So that's how the main level was carried. And then the top floor, we actually, off those I-beams that cantilevered out past the post to the exterior walls, that's where we were able to take 4x4 steel posts and go up to the second floor. And those actually were against the brick wall on the main level. So today, when you walk into the bakery or the coffee shop and you look around, it's clear span. There's no wall down the center like you see in a lot of old buildings. But if you pay attention to the exterior walls, there are steel posts that go up and catch another set of I-beams going across that catch the floor trusses for the top floor. So it was a very neat way to put a building together, being able to utilize steel and utilize even the floor trusses for all our mechanicals and plumbing and electrical. Ended up making a really neat finished base. So this is also my first real experience with a TPO roof membrane. And we had several leaks in the build or throughout the build that we were chasing. And finally, I was able to get on the roof and figure out that when they lapped the TPO membrane, they'd actually lapped it in reverse. They'd reverse lapped it. And then all the little patches led to several little leaks. So with just a water hose and an inspection, we were able to figure those things out and work with the original installer. It was still under warranty, thank goodness, but we were able to get that fixed. But that was the first time I had really worked with a TPO roof, and I guess to see how simple it was, but also how simple it was to mess up. Since then, I've been able to use it on several other projects, but we have not reverse lapped it though, fun fact. So one thing I'll point out is that if you're dealing with an old brick construction building like this, you want to make sure that you spend some extra time cleaning the inside of the brick. If you're going to expose it to pull the mortar off or the plaster off, you want to make sure you brush it. We actually washed it down with a water hose, brushed it again. We used a cleaner to clean that brick. Even leaf blowers to blow off. We tried to get as much loose dust off as we could. And then you want to put several coats of a good masonry sealer on it, because you don't want that dust or that grit to continuously fall inside your living space. And so I think we ended up with 3 or 4 coats of sealer before we ever even started framing the interior, so we could get a really good seal on that brick. So dealing with an old brick structure like this is much different than a lot of the houses that we build today. You know, air sealing it really wasn't an option. Insulating it with lots of insulation or exterior insulation, also not an option. The roof actually has under the TPO roof, there's the membrane, there's actually 2 or 3 layers of foam board that was laid and installed prior to us buying the structure. In the loft area, in the apartment, several areas of the loft are exposed. Those areas did not receive any more insulation. In the areas that aren't exposed, though, we set new ceiling joists and sheetrock ceilings. That allowed us to add more foam insulation underneath the roof deck to help get a better R value on that lid of the building. The brick walls we left exposed in most rooms. The ones that did get covered, we did put batted insulation in those wall cavities. But overall, it's a very poorly insulated structure. has a lot of thermal mass with that much of brick. So it's actually been surprisingly easy, or easier than I thought, to heat and cool the building. But it's definitely not our typical construction. So we had to rely pretty heavily on the mechanical engineers to design that HVAC system and size it accordingly. Because then you can imagine the summer months or in the dead of winter, it really requires a pretty large demand from that heating and cooling unit. Overall, I would say doing this commercial project was such a neat experience for me, and it made me learn so much more about construction. Things like tons of steel work and I-beams, having to work with the fabricators and the engineers to get that steel sized correctly and installed correctly. And in fact, a lot of our carpenters and my team, we actually installed a lot of the steel with a fab shop and a welder. So that was a really neat experience to see that go together. And then dealing with fire sprinklers, dealing with the structural engineer and the commercial world for all the electrical, it was just neat to see that side. And I think that really, it gave me a lot of confidence going forward. It definitely inspired me to get into more commercial real estate. That structure ended up being I told you it was two buildings side by side. We actually had two loft apartments upstairs, and then downstairs we have a coffee shop and a bakery. So basically, we turned it into 4 units. And if you're in real estate or thinking about getting into real estate, I would encourage you, if you have the opportunity to make a building multi-tenant like that. To me, it's a lot safer investment as a real estate developer, because if one tenant moves out, you have 3 more carrying the weight. Whereas if it was all one tenant, like one restaurant owner that had rented this whole building from us, if they had gone out of business or moved out, that'd have really put me in a hard spot trying to pay that mortgage every month. All right, so I hope you enjoyed hearing about the House of Vacuums renovation project, and I guess my first experience in commercial construction. That project actually won a state area award for the historical renovation division. And that was a really neat experience there to get to share that with more people across the state and across the nation. If you're not already following us on Instagram, please go do so. It's at Will King Builds. And just remember, iron sharpens iron, so keep grinding, keep watching these videos, and we'll see you right here on The Build Show.